Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Florida City and County Management Association webinar entitled Working with Your Lobbyist, Tips on Hiring, Contract Revisions, Accountability, Reporting, and Prioritizing Issues. My name is Bob Lee, and I have the pleasure of serving as your host today. Joining me as co-hosts are Dr. Dina Hurst and Mr. Mike Ryko. Dean and Mike both work with the John Scott Daly Florida Institute of Government, and they'll be the people who will be assisting all of us with any of our technology needs, and also facilitating some of the Q&A that I'm going to be describing here in just a moment. Sponsors for today's webinar include the Florida City and County Management Association, of course, the Florida League of Cities, the John Scott Daly Florida Institute of Government, the Center for Florida Local Government Excellence, and two corporate sponsors, Strategic Government Resources and Government Services Group. For those who haven't participated in an FCCMA webinar before, I do want to refer you to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Most notably, I want to ask you to look at the chat section, the chat box there. We call it the Q&A chat box. That's how you can communicate with us by sending in questions that you may have for today's presenters. We always do our very best to address every question, and we take them as they come in. So you don't have to wait till the end of the webinar to get your question answered. So even if you have a question on a term or just some nomenclature of any type that one of our presenters references, please don't hesitate to type it in there, and we'll make sure you get a response to that. As Dina also mentioned, I think previously, I just want to reiterate that if you look at the materials tab, you'll be able to download our PowerPoint presentation for today. With those introductory comments, let me introduce you today to today's panelists. The first person is Casey Cook. Casey's the Director of Legislative Affairs for the Florida League of Cities. And many of you at FCCMA, of course, know Casey in his role as Executive Director of the association. Also, another experienced and very capable lobbyist, Ryan Matthews, with the partner, he's a partner with the principal firm of Peoples, Smith, and Matthews. I guess I read that wrong. He is with Peoples, Smith, and Matthews, and he is a partner in the firm. Ryan, Casey, welcome both of you.
Thank you, Bob.
Before we get into the Q&A part, I would like to just describe a little bit of our format. It's going to be informal. We have a few open-ended questions, which I'm going to ask Casey and Ryan, and they'll be addressing those. But I think those questions should generate some additional questions from you as the attendees. So again, I want to emphasize that this is to be an informal webinar, and we encourage you to submit questions for Casey and Ryan. Casey, Ryan, before we begin, if you'll do one more thing for me, would you mind just summarizing your backgrounds briefly for today's attendees?
Sure, thank you, Bob. So I've been with the League of Cities for 14 years. I've been lobbying the state legislature for the past 12. Recently, as of September 1, took over as the Director of Legislative Affairs for the League, in addition to my role as Executive Director of FCCMA.
Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Matthews, as Bob mentioned. My background is a little bit of a hybrid. I am both a lawyer and a lobbyist. I too worked for the League of Cities for just under 6 years. Starting back in 2010, I went and worked for the Department of Environmental Protection here in the state of Florida, where I held a couple of different positions, including interim secretary for the time period of about a year. For the last 3.5 years or so, I have been a partner at the private lobbying firm of Peoples, Smith, and Matthews.
Thanks, Ryan. Casey, let's go ahead and start with our first question. And we'll put that up on the screen. Question number 1. And Casey, I'm going to ask if you would address this first, but I'm going to go ahead and read it in the event that somebody is following along by telephone, but they're not seeing the visuals. The question is, when considering hiring a lobbyist, what are the important factors that should be considered relative to their experience, communication style, fee, and scope of work?
Sure. Thank you, Bob. Let's back up for a second though and say, why should we hire a lobbyist? I think you hire a lobbyist for relationships, for access, and for their knowledge of both the legislative process and potentially their subject matter expertise if it's a particular policy issue. A couple important things to start with. One, you are your city or county's #1 lobbyist. That your contract lobbyist is there to help you, but ultimately you are your biggest champion. And the second part of that is your local delegation should be your biggest champion as well. And it's on you as the manager or on your elected officials to go and educate that local member or your delegation as to why your issue is important and make them your champion. The third thing I think is that good policy takes time. And so while the legislative session is 60 days, I would not, depending on the issue, I think it's unrealistic at times to think that you can accomplish your policy goal in 1 year. I mean, you look at short-term rentals as a perfect example. That discussion has gone on for the last decade. Since the law changed in 2014, we've had battles every year, both pushing legislation that local governments liked and fighting off legislation from the other side. And so it takes time to develop momentum, and you have to look at this, I think, as a multi-year process, and certainly some appropriations projects fall into that same category. Before you get into hiring a lobbyist, I think you need to do an internal assessment. I think you need to look at, what is it that we need? What's the cost of success without a lobbyist? Some may take an approach where I'm going to send a staff member up. I don't need to hire a contract lobbyist. And I think you need to crunch the numbers and calculate what that will cost you. Or if it's you as the manager, how many trips to Tallahassee is it going to take you to achieve success? I think you need to ask yourself, who do we have relationships with? Hopefully you have relationships with your local delegation members. It's up to you to make them your champion and explain why your issue is important. But that needs to be part of that internal assessment. I think you need to look at, what is our ask? Is it an appropriations issue? Is it a policy issue? Or is it both? That's going to help me determine the type of lobbyist that I would want to hire. Then when I'm looking at the lobbyist, what type of experience do they have? Are they a subject matter expert? Are they a budget expert? Are they a jack of all trades or a generalist? I think one of the most important factors is they need to be a good communicator, and they need to be able to distill complex information down to its most basic form so that it's easily understandable. Who are their other clients? Do they have a bunch of other clients? Do they represent any clients that are trying to preempt local governments? What are the conflicts? Who do they know? And how does it benefit my ask? What's my budget? And then, there are pros and cons to large firms and small firms. And so I think those are all questions that should be asked, or at least you should have an idea of what you want when you're sizing up whether or not we need to hire a lobbyist, and then you've made the short list and ultimately are making that final decision. Ryan, I'll turn it over to you for more.
Sure, thanks, Casey. And I will likely reinforce a lot of what Casey just said because it is true and accurate. The first question that I would ask myself is, what is my ultimate goal? Are you seeking an appropriation through the appropriation process? Because there are lobbyists who simply spend a majority, if not 90 to 100% of their time seeking state appropriations for local governments and other clients. Are you seeking a policy change? And that policy change could be proactive in nature, where you're trying to change statute, or defensive in nature. And you really want to boil down what ultimate success do you want to have. There are a multitude of different lobbyists out there. I usually try to tell people, or my usual saying is that there's substance, there's flash, and there's really very few who can do both well. Because as Casey mentioned, a lot of what we do as lobbyists is make connections. We have relationships in Tallahassee with folks in leadership, and ultimately, leadership in Tallahassee is who makes decisions. You have a 120-member House of Representatives, where truthfully, only about 4 to 5 of those folks really shape where a session is going to go from a policy perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have relationships with all 120, but it is going to be very subject matter specific in terms of who you're going to reach out to accomplish even the most menial task during a 60-day legislative session. Casey made a really good point that I would like to highlight, and that is that lobbyists really should supplement the work you all do at home. You have the connections with your local delegation, you see them in the grocery store, you have the relationship, and outside of session, you have the ability to go and have a cup of coffee, which hopefully happens on a quarterly, if not more recent or recurring effort and time. Because what you're doing when you're hiring a lobbyist is you're hiring boots on the ground in Tallahassee. I tell my clients that I see myself as an extension of the city or county that I represent. So it behooves me to understand the issues that you want to accomplish to the best of my nature. Now, am I going to have the same knowledge as a building department director? No, I'm not. But it's incumbent upon me to understand the current status of the law, the resolution or the goal that you hope to achieve, and then 3, what Casey said, to effectively communicate to folks in Tallahassee who also may not have any idea what a building department in a local government does, to explain the current circumstance and how everyone is better and public policy is better by making a change or defending an action that is being taken by the House or the Senate here in Tallahassee. I think other considerations, as Casey had mentioned, we can get into probably an hour-long conversation about the size of a lobbyist firm or a lobbying firm in Tallahassee. That is going to be totally and wholly unique to your individual experience as a city or county manager and what you hope to achieve. There are firms in Tallahassee that have upwards of 250, 300 clients. Those are both private and public sector firms. There are lobbyists or lobbying firms that only have a dozen or so clients, and they're 1 or 2 men and women shops who can sometimes operate remotely. They don't simply have a physical office in Tallahassee. So the most basic question that you want to ask yourselves, what do I hope to accomplish? There are folks who have agency experience, like myself, with the Department of Environmental Protection. I would hold myself out to being somewhat of a subject matter expert on environmental matters in the state of Florida, because I worked internally for 3 years for the state agency that oversaw the natural resources of this state. If you have a transportation issue, not surprisingly, a lot of agency heads come out of state government and then go into private lobbying practice because they have relationships within the governor's office, they have relationships within the agency and any executive branch of government that you're hoping to also advocate before or in front of. And then you have former speakers, former Senate presidents who also do the same thing. It is not unique that folks operate within the functions of state government and then leave and try to help people navigate getting things done in Tallahassee from a policy level. So again, I would just go back and reinforce, ask yourself what your ultimate goal is, because you can find a specific lobbyist for really anything that you want to achieve. And then it's a matter of, what is the time savings that you would receive by having someone in Tallahassee full time to try to accomplish those goals for you.
Yeah, and just a couple other points that I think Ryan can expand on this a little bit. how do you select a lobbyist? You know, is it a decision solely up to the manager? Do you form a selection committee made up of some of your key staff? I mean, everyone in this process wants to tell you how important they are and how connected they are. And you ultimately need to have, you know, have a process where you can figure out whether they're telling the truth or not. What does your RFP look like? What are the asks that you lay out in that? Some of these RFPs, you know, and Ryan can tell you, they take a lot of time to respond to. Are you asking the right questions within your RFP? You know, those are all things that you can do on the front end, and I think there's some good models out there. But that's some stuff that you can do on the front end to position yourself for success once it, you know, to hire a good lobbyist that's going to, you know, represent what you want them to do, or, you know, do what you want them to do and give you the best chance for success. Ryan, do you want to talk more about the RFP or selection process?
I'd be happy to. And again, this is going to be unique to your current circumstance within your city or county, and ultimately what your objective is. My firm happens to represent the League of Cities. We are on the contract team for the Florida Association of Counties, and we represent both cities and counties of small, medium, and large stature throughout the state of Florida. So I've seen a number of RFPs. My advice would always be to, again, look to what you want to accomplish and then be specific when you put out that request for proposals and looking at the qualifications of individual firms. If you do have a significant Department of Transportation issue, it would probably behoove you to hire a firm who has extensive DOT participation. And generally, you will see that as firms list their qualifications. I would always ask, what successes have the firm enjoyed over the last 2 to 3 years? I would ask, who or whom do you have relationships with in both the House and Senate? For those of you who are a little less familiar in Tallahassee, we just finished an organizational session where the 2 presiding officers of both the House and Senate were installed as the leader of their chamber for the next 2 years. So we now have Speaker Chris Frowles from Panelists County, who will be the Speaker of the House of Representatives for the next 2 years. We have President Wilton Simpson from Trilby, Dade City, Pasco County area, who is going to be the President of the Senate for the next 2 years. They have both just released their leadership teams. So you can go on the Florida House website, the Florida Senate website, and look at who is that group, that core group of folks, maybe 8 to 10 individuals within each chamber, who are going to really move the needle from a policy perspective. Again, if you're looking for an appropriation, well, I think you probably want to hire a firm who's got a very good relationship with the House and Senate Appropriations Chairman. Kelly Stargell from Lakeland is the chairwoman of appropriations in the Florida Senate, and Jay Trumbull from the Panhandle is going to be the appropriations chairman in the House of Representatives. So don't be afraid to ask the question based upon what you want to get accomplished. What are your relationships? In fact, I would go so far as to say, once you receive those RFP responses from lobbying firms, check up on the lobbyists in terms of what they're telling you, who they are most connected with. And ask that question of the members of the House and Senate if they're within your delegation. If you hire my firm and I say that I'm close with Senator X, well, I would hope you call Senator X and say, do you know who Ryan Matthews is? Number one, do you like the guy? You think you'd let him in your office if he wanted to lobby you on a specific issue? Those are all questions that you should certainly ask within an RFP. Casey brought up a good point, and we can expand on it a little bit further in the webinar if we get back to it. But conflicts of interest, there are more
Ryan,
and
may I
more.
jump in? Ryan, may I jump in? I think the second question we have may even address some of the conflict of interest. Just so we could move on with these, if you don't mind. I think this is a great discussion, and I particularly would like you to think about this term relationship that you both keep talking about, because I think we'd like to explore that a little bit more too as we go through this webinar. But just so we can get through these 4 questions, I think the conflict of interest may have been part of the second one, if you don't mind addressing it at this time. And as a matter of fact, I think, Ryan, I was going to have you start with question number 2,
Sure.
So you could pick up on the conflict of interest issue and then just address some other aspects of this question. But For the attendees, let me just state what that question is, again, for those who may not have a visual. The question number 2 is, in terms of accountability, how should you handle realistic expectations, conflicts of interest, and regular reports/updates? Ryan, why don't you take it first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think above all else, open and honest communication and conversation has to occur. You as a city or county manager need to be steadfast in the expectations that you have when you're hiring a lobbyist. You are in fact using resources of a local government to petition the state government. My firm takes that very seriously, as 90 to 95% of our work is done on behalf of local governments or local government utilities. So we understand that we are dealing with taxpayer dollars. So realistic expectations need to be set early and often. You need to have, again, the comfort with a lobbyist who's going to tell you open and honestly that your objectives may not be that achievable. If you are looking to, let's say, as an example, pass a new category of local option surtax in the coming year, well, historically, or at least within the last decade, we have a massive anti-tax House of Representatives in the state of Florida. No matter the budget deficit, and we see roughly a $4 to $5.5 billion deficit in the coming 2 years because of the coronavirus, if you have a lobbyist that tells you that they guarantee you that they can pass a new tax, they're full of it, quite frankly. So I would hope that the management of expectations on the part of a lobbyist, it is incumbent upon us to let you know how difficult something could be to achieve. There is no reason. If you have someone who guarantees an outcome, you're dealing with the wrong person, first and foremost. So expectations, I think, are very important. Not only expectations of what you hope to accomplish, but expectations about communication. We have a number of clients, and again, this will absolutely be client specific, who want more communication than others. I have clients who simply are satisfied by an end of the month report on actions that my firm has taken on topics that we've discussed in the past. I have other clients who want a weekly call during session, during committee week, to let them know what has happened in regard to their issue. And so when we talk about expectations, I think another thing to really focus on is, and we can talk about this through the lens of an RFP, is setting an appropriate scope of work. I think it's one of those things that you need to identify that you expect your lobbyist to do A, B, and C. So that way you both are under the same understanding that this is the work the lobbyist is going to accomplish on your behalf during the legislative session. Now, you also have lobbyists or lobbying firms such as mine who operate outside of the 60-day legislative session and committee week and lobby executive agencies, being water management districts, DEP, DOT, DEO, et cetera, and try to actively seek grants for their clients as well. That all needs to be laid out in the scope of services, because I think one thing that you won't want to have happen is if you hire a lobbyist with the expectation that they're going to work on your behalf during the legislative session, and let's say you set that price at $35,000 for that work, and then you call the lobbyist 2 weeks after session and say, I've got a grant that I'd really like to go after. Is that something you'd be willing to do within our current scope? Or you might have a lobbyist say, we'd be happy to do it for you for an additional fee. So again, decide whether or not you want the sort of sniper approach of, I simply want this lobbyist to work on my behalf during the legislative session on any number of enumerated policy issues. I want them to monitor all legislation and tell me what could negatively affect me or positively affect me. Or I want them to do both of those things. And also, hey, outside of session, I'd love for you to look at all grants coming through the state that I may be eligible to receive state funding for. So that is one thing, again, in terms of establishing a scope of services that you're looking for, because many clients that we have simply hire us to pass a local bill, and that's it, nothing more. Now, as a lobbyist, I would still tell them that there are numerous local government preemptions or unfunded mandates coming down the pike that they should be mindful of. But I also don't expect, if I'm hired to file and pass a local bill, then I'm going to go and engage on a vacation rental issue on behalf of that same client, because that wasn't in the original scope of services.
Yeah, and made a number of good points, Ryan. And I think the first one that I want to jump in on is conflicts of interest, because there's nothing that ticks me off more than seeing a lobbyist that represents multiple local governments, 10, 20, working on a bill trying to preempt local governments. So how are they going to disclose those conflicts to you? You should know that on the front end. If a bill or an amendment comes up that they get hired or retained mid-session, you should have a process in place or be crystal clear in how they let you know that they are working on that issue or against, what you're working on. Ryan made a great point about part of their job is to basically tell you what the political landscape is and look for ways to craft an argument so that your proposal can work. What's important to the big three? By the big three, I mean the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, and the Governor. In the past, we know that water funding has been an important issue for one, two, or all three of those people. So how can I, if it's an appropriation project, what appropriations do I need, or what projects do I have going or in the pipeline that I may want to move up my list because it allows me the best chance for success? I can make a good argument and tie it into their proposal. Another thing that I think is important to mention is in that contract, or just to reiterate what Ryan said, it's important to engage on policy. And I can tell you as a League of Cities lobbyist, and I'm sure if the counties were here, they would say the same thing. It is frustrating to see lobbyists retained by local governments that don't want to work on policy. And I think a common response back from lobbyist to client is, oh, well, that's what you have the League of Cities for. That's what you have the Association of Counties for. We need to focus our ass on this $500,000 for this project. Well, in a lot of cases, the policy that they're talking about is going to have a significantly bigger impact on your operations than that $500,000. And we should have more contract lobbyists that represent cities and counties engaged on the policy side of things. I think another part of it is, how do you measure success? It is easy to measure success on the appropriation side. I paid my lobbyist $50,000. They brought back home $500,000 for this project. That was a pretty good return on my investment. That's success. On the policy side, though, the water gets muddy, and I think that's why some have shied away from engaging their contract lobbyist on it, because if the three most powerful people in the process don't get everything they want, it's unrealistic to expect a lobbyist to pass every bill for every client that they have. I've seen bills die before simply because the voting member on the committee got ticked off at the bill sponsor the day before, and they were a yes, and all of a sudden they switched to a no because they were PO'd at the time. Stuff like that happens in the process, but I think a way to measure it is, are you engaging with the League of Cities? Who did you meet with on this issue? What were the arguments that you made? Who were the other lobbyists that you worked on? In addition to the League of Cities, who else did you work with on this issue? What legislators did you meet with? Well, all of that stuff. I think it's very easy to ferret out whether somebody actually did the work or they just simply, want to report back what they heard on a League of Cities or an Association of Counties, phone call summarizing the week. On the reporting side of things, what do you want? I mean, there's good arguments on both sides. It's nice to know that the person you hired to do a job did work on that job during that week of session. But remember, you're hiring that lobbyist to go and meet with people at the Capitol, and every minute they spend putting a report together on who they met with or doing, summarizing the bills that may impact your city, that's a minute you're taking them away from meeting with people at the Capitol and potentially talking about your project. How do you get that information? How do you, determine that they're doing their job? The League of Cities, I think, and the counties are the same way. We have calls every Monday where the League's lobbyists run through, these are the important policy bills on our radar this week, looking ahead a week or two. This is what we see out there. We send out our on tap at the cap and post legislative bill summaries to our website. Is it worth having your lobbyists go and copying and pasting off of the League's website, putting it on company letterhead and sending it to you as if it's their own work? I don't know that that's a good use of their time. These are all questions you should be asking. Maybe it is for you and your situation, and for others it's not. But I think our goal today is to just provide some stuff that you should be thinking about. Either if you have a lobbyist, all right, these may be some new ways to hold them accountable or to make sure they're doing what they're saying. Or if you're looking to hire a lobbyist in the future, this is preparing you so that you can make a good selection.
Casey, Ryan, before we move on to the third question, I would like to explore a little bit more on the, I guess, conflicts of interest and expectations. Specifically, Ryan, you mentioned one firm may have a couple hundred clients, another may have a dozen, and their staff would hopefully represent that accordingly. But if I've never had a lobbyist, a number of local governments don't have paid professional lobbyists, and I'm considering it, how do I know that when you submit a report stating that you've spent time doing this, that it isn't time you would have spent anyways, because you have several clients that are requesting your scope to do the exact same thing you're doing, that you're advising this jurisdiction that you're doing. In other words, you're sending out a report saying what you've done that you would have done even without that client. There may be some questions about that. Similarly, in terms of prioritizing your time, when a lobbyist is going to prioritize their time, if they have several clients, how do they determine what's going to be the priority? Because I think, as I think one or both of you hinted, sometimes the scopes of expectations from your clients aren't always congruent either. Sometimes they actually conflict. And maybe you didn't know they conflicted initially, and maybe they don't conflict that much. Maybe the only conflict is they're both, two or more are applying for the same funding. And how do you determine where your priorities are if your relationship with the legislator or legislators say, Casey, Ryan, you got to pick. What's the priority? So how do you, could you talk a little bit about that process? Because obviously it's a difficult one.
Sure, I'll tackle the first part of that first, Bob. So again, I mentioned at the onset that in our firm, the way that we've operated historically, both Bill Peoples and myself are attorneys. So we basically hold ourselves out to the rules of the Florida bar, which if a conflict of interest arises, you are obligated to contact both clients and let them know, whether that be in writing or over the phone. Thankfully, in the existence of our firm, since we represent mostly, if not almost all local governments, we rarely have conflicts, but they have arisen. So again, not all lobbyists are attorneys, so they are not mandated per se to disclose a conflict, but you yourself can go and look, and I don't know the actual site, but there is a Florida lobbyist registration, and we can get you the site of the actual web address of that, where you can go and look at all of the registrations, because as lobbyists, though, we are mandated by law to register for a client, and so a database of that registration is collected and is available online. So you can look firm by firm or principal by principal, client by client, and see who is registered to lobby for who. So I think that's one thing to do your own homework when in terms of conflict, because quite frankly, and I would never speak ill of folks in my industry, but not everybody is going to be open and transparent with you. That's just a simple fact of life. So again, as it relates to conflict and the disclosure of conflicts, we may handle it a little bit differently in our firm because we actually do have attorneys. Now, there are plenty of firms who have attorneys who are also lobbyists. So I would put in your RFP, if you have attorneys that are working on your issues, that they do disclose, maybe even in writing, that a conflict has arisen. And then hopefully you, the lobbyist, and will be able to work out a result that everybody's happy with there. So when it comes to how do you effectively work on multiple clients who may be looking for the same thing, again, I think it's a matter of disclosure, because it's pretty apparent that as the multitude of preemptions are filed every year, most local governments through the League of Cities are working against that. And Casey made a good point. I think to go back to the RFP process, I think it's incumbent on you all to put within your RFPs some language that says your lobbyist will work with either the Florida League of Cities or the Florida Association of Counties on general policy matters. That way you can call them and say, this big issue has come up in 2021. I would really like you to work with the league or FAC in terms of, working together, growing the team, if you will, to try to defeat that measure. That's something that is likely, a bonus to have within your RFP language. My firm in particular, and I can only speak to my firm, is probably a medium-sized lobbying firm. We've got roughly 42, 45 clients, and that number would vary anytime throughout the year, depending on the work we do on a yearly basis or just session specific, et cetera. We try to limit the number of clients that we accept based on appropriations, because at the end of the day, if you've got 200 clients, 100 of whom are looking for appropriations, you might be asked to make difficult decisions in terms of what priority you're going to put on that specific ask. And it's sort of the old adage of, I love all my children the same. That ultimately is not the case, unfortunately, if you are driven. I will say it's rare that I have been personally in a case with an appropriation chairman where he has told me you have to pick X or over Y. Generally, the way the appropriations process works is that you've got opportunities to get in the first House budget and the first Senate budget, and then you hope to God that you're in both at the end of the day. So you usually have multiple avenues to seek an appropriation, be it through the House or the Senate. And you're rarely limited to that circumstance that you brought up, Bob, where it's, okay, give me your list of 3 and that's all you get. It may happen, but really that's why in our case, we try to limit the number of folks we have who are seeking appropriations. So we try to prevent that on the front end.
And, I think I'll jump onto both of those. On the conflicts piece, in addition to seeing, who their clients are, and that's one piece of data that you can find. Probably 2 to 4 years ago, the House actually increased their disclosure requirements, and it's by bill. And so for every House bill that's filed, if you're working on it and you're ethical, you are tagging your name, your firm, your company to that bill. From the League of Cities perspective, it's been great because I can see who my friends are and who I'm fighting with. Prior to those, increased disclosure requirements, a lot of times it was tough to find out who was behind a bill. And it took multiple meetings and digging to find out who the group behind that legislator was. Now I see, these are the folks that are with me and these are the folks that are against me. And I can reach out directly to my friends, form a stakeholder group, and we are more powerful working together, than all independently. So I think that is an important thing to be checking. Now, I'm sure that there are some folks that are hired and they're not following the rules and they're not tagging themselves to that bill. To my knowledge, there hasn't been anybody busted or caught violating that rule. So I'm sure it happens, but the good ones, the ethical ones, are tagging themselves to the bill, and it's something you should be checking. Big firm versus little firm. This is, there are pros and cons to both sides. And full disclosure, you heard Ryan say it, People Smith and Matthews represents the League of Cities and FAC. I think a big part of that decision was their subject matter expertise, the fact that they represent local governments, and frankly, they're good, honest people. I will stop with the infomercial for People Smith and Matthews, but I think one of the benefits to a smaller firm or a firm that has only clients in a particular space is you rule out conflicts, and it's much easier for them to become subject matter experts. The big firms have value too. I mean, there are some firms that have 50 to 100 members in them. They're past agency heads, they're past Senate presidents, speakers of the House, movers and shakers across the board. They have access. The larger firms have bigger political action committees, so they can write more campaign contributions and they can get you in the door. The problem, though, as that Ryan talked about, was if it's an appropriation issue and I have 150 clients and I walk into the appropriations chair and I say I want these 15 projects, and he or she looks back at me and says, pick 5. That's, you know, are you going to be in that 5? That's a question you should be asking yourself as a local government. I mean, there is definitely, there are pros and cons to both. And I even think looking at where my particular lobbyist is in their career. If it's somebody that is already at the top and has established themselves as a major player in the business, or is it somebody that's a hustler that's hungry, that is out trying to make a name for themselves? Pros and cons to both of those. So those are some things that I think you should think about. And the final point here is make sure you know who's going to be working on your issue, because sometimes, you know, in some firms, they bring in their show dog to do the final presentation to seal the deal and to make sure that they're selected. How much of that person's time are you going to be getting? Who else is going to be working on your issues when that person is not? So I'll go ahead and stop on that right there, Bob.
Let's move on. Thank you both, and thanks for addressing that so thoroughly. Let's move on to question number 3. If you want to put that up on the screen there, Mike. Question number 3. How do you determine prominent issues that a lobbyist should focus on? That is, what role should the lobbyist and the agency representatives have in determining these issues? And with this one, Casey, why don't you start us off here?
So I'm going to circle back to question 1. And the first thing I said was that you should be doing an internal assessment. Part of that internal assessment is what are our wants and what are our needs. So you should have tier 1 priorities, tier 2 priorities. This is the stuff we absolutely have to have. This is the stuff that would be nice to have. And that's especially for an appropriations issue. You should be receptive to feedback. Remember, your lobbyist knows the lay of the land and they're going to give you advice. Your lobbyist may come to you and say, this does not have a chance. You're trying to pass a new tax in an incredibly conservative legislature that is anti-tax, and they've all signed Grover Norquist's pledge. That thing is DOA. They know what they're talking about, and you need to be open to that and look to other areas or other potential priorities that you've identified in that initial, internal assessment. What's important to the big 3? I mentioned it earlier, but is there a way to tie your priority to something that's important to the governor, the speaker, the Senate president? What's the financial outlook if it's an appropriation? This year, I think you're going to hear a consistent message that this is not a good year for appropriations projects. So would I want my lobbyists spending all of their time trying to get me appropriations in a year where they're potentially looking at significant budget cuts? What's my chance for success? That's something you should be thinking about. On the policy side, I think your expectation is their expectation of you is for you to lay out, these are the issues that are important, right? These disrupt municipal or county operations. They're going to cause a number of headaches. Here's why. I think your expectation of them is that they can articulate that and that they can explain your issue, why it's important, what the local impact is, and do it in a way that's easily understandable by the masses. Because when you're talking with legislators, there's different camps of legislators. There are some that may be in that business. So they're subject matter experts and they want to get down in the weeds and they're going to ask really hard questions. Can your lobbyist answer them? What's your process if the lobbyist comes back and says, hey, I need to get some feedback on this? Who in your organization is getting them the information they need? There may be some legislators that really just need the 2-sentence explanation of the problem, your solution, who's for it, who's against it. That's very easy to do, but on those big issues, your lobbyist should be able to explain your issue. They should be able to answer questions on your issue. And in some cases, as your representative, if you're unavailable to get to Tallahassee, they should be able to testify and sound intelligent on those issues and make a good case if you're trying to pass a bill through a committee or defeat it in that committee.
Yeah, and I really don't have much to add. Casey has given pretty extensive commentary on that. I think what I would say is the role of a lobbyist in identifying what your priorities are. Again, if you have someone who you see as an extension of your local government, they should be fairly in tune to the needs, wants, desires of the area of the state. What most affects you from a policy perspective, what most affects you in terms of you need a new wastewater treatment plant, et cetera, in terms of the type of grants or appropriations that you would be going after. I do think that for those governments who have a governmental affairs professional in-house, historically what we have seen since we've had the benefit of working with clients over multiple decades is that we become, again, fairly close to those folks who are in those positions because we're talking to them constantly. So I do think that the lobbyists can help you all on the front end identify maybe where your realistic priorities, as Casey mentioned, are. And how acceptable, for lack of a better term, those will be to the legislature. Again, you should have a lobbyist who's willing to come with these days either in Zoom and hopefully again someday in person to discuss with the commission certain context in terms of where we are in the political world, in the political realities of the time, and maybe it's an issue, a hot button issue that you're seeking to engage in, or maybe it's an issue that no one in the legislature is currently contemplating, and you're being the champion for that specific policy measure. That all depends, and the lobbyist should be able to help tell the story to your councilmen and women, commissioners, et cetera, about the realities of what goes on in Tallahassee, because quite frankly, most folks don't pay attention to the extent that a lobbyist would. I mean, even though we're here during committee weeks, during the 60-day legislative session, a lot of what leads up from a policy perspective, from a subject matter area, occurs well before session even starts. So as long as you have a trusted representative here to keep their ear to the ground in the way things should be taking shape, you're going to be better informed to be able to relay that information to not only to your electeds, but to your citizens who are calling and asking you all, what are you doing about the folks in Tallahassee and what they're currently trying or trying not to do?
Thanks, Ryan. Casey, we have about 10 minutes left. What I'd like to do is move on to the fourth and final question, which I think will enable you also just to pick up on any information you want to share that maybe you overlooked in the first three questions, or as a result of listening to each other, may have generated some a thought on something you'd like to spend a little time on. So the fourth question is as follows. Summarize the do's and don'ts when working with a lobbyist and provide some real stories to reinforce your recommendations. Now, I know the real stories probably could take in excess of 10 minutes, but if you do have something that would complement some do's and don'ts that you would recommend as part of your summation here, please share that with our attendees, if you will. And with this, Ryan, why don't you start us off, please?
Sure, thanks, Bob. And I'll try to be a little bit more brief this time around because I know we're running out of time. Prior to the start of the webinar, I wrote down 5 do's or don'ts, so I'll share those. And I'll have a story with one of those. So first, do your homework before hiring a firm. I think Casey and I have both talked extensively on that. Number 2, and this is where I have the story, do take your lobbyist lead when dealing with members, especially when it comes to dealing with members in session. I had a client 2 years ago who came up with the goal of talking to a bill sponsor of ours who was pushing a policy matter that we were being proactive in. And so what I said prior to going in was, we need to be thankful, we need to be mindful of the fact that this representative doesn't have a lot of time right now, we're in the heat of session. So we really just want to go in and say thank you, and maybe talk about one other thing. I brought the client in, we sat down and I opened with, Representative, just wanted to thank you so much for sponsoring this, very appreciative. And the client started railing on the member about things that they weren't doing and things that the legislature was passing. Well, you could probably guess where our bill went after that. Didn't pass. And we kind of left with bad taste in our mouth. So use your lobbyists to educate you all, if you're not familiar with how to effectively communicate with a legislator. Number 3, establish the scope of work when you're looking for a lobbyist or a lobbying firm to do either policy or appropriation work for you. Number 4, don't panic. It's a 60-day legislative session. A lot happens during those 60 days. Casey brought up earlier that he has seen bills die simply because one member got upset with another member in committee. And decided to vote down, and that was the deciding vote. There are variables that are outside of your control during the process. So my final piece of advice is educate yourself on the process itself. This is a highly member-driven process. It is competitive. These are type A personalities who are essentially fighting each other. Sometimes that happens in party, out of party, etc. There are bill limits in the House in terms of how many pieces of legislation certain House members can put forward. You have 7 now, as it used to be 6 bills that they can be filed. So the bandwidth of your representatives in the House of Representatives are limited. The Senate has unlimited pieces of legislation they're filed. And then there are multiple timelines and stresses that occur during session that it can affect a member that you need to be aware of. Again, another reason to have a lobbyist, because they can fill you in terms of what's going on. If you educate yourself in terms of how the process works, the ebb and flow of most legislative sessions, you're going to be in a better position to succeed.
Good comments, Ryan. I agree with all of them. I'd say my list is do get them good information or data, tell a personal story on the short-term rental issue. It's been helpful when a manager or an elected official stood up and said, we pulled this information from DBPR and we've got 15 licensed short-term rentals in our community. We went on Airbnb and there's 250 listings on Airbnb for vacation rentals in our community. That drove home the point that there was rampant unlicensed activity and that the state agency in charge of licensing these things wasn't doing an adequate job. So getting good information allows for the lobbyist to make a good argument. Give them access to a subject matter expert for if there are technical city or county specific questions. Who is that? How does that, what's the flow chart for that process? Who is their point of contact within the city or the county? Can your elected officials engage your lobbyist? Or does that request go through the manager or the deputy or your government affairs person if you have one? Those are things to think about. Give them access to your city attorney if there is a need to craft amendments on a policy bill. I think those are all important things, and when you look at the cities and counties that do it the right way, they have checked all of those boxes.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Casey. Just a couple minutes left. Any further comment from either of you at this time before I make some closing comments?
Get engaged on the policy stuff, folks. We need your help. We need your information. It's just as, if not more important than, the appropriation side of things.
Ryan, anything further?
No, I would just say, I would echo Casey's comments again. I mean, I as a private sector lobbyist who has been in-house at the League of Cities before, you know, the way that things get done in Tallahassee, it is a lot easier to kill a bill than pass a bill. So we should put ourselves in the best position as local governments to widen the pool and the team, add to the team in terms of legislation that we're trying to defeat. There were 3,000 bills filed last year during the 2020 legislative session. Only 210 passed. So really, there is efficacy in numbers. So let's just get that let's bolster those as much as we can.
Let me ask, and maybe you can give a 30-second response to this. Early on in the webinar, I think, Ryan, you mentioned about you can have a 60-day lobbyist or one that's throughout the year. I guess my question to both of you, and again, brief response if you would, from your experience, how much has already been decided by the legislators before the session starts?
I would say that in terms of big ticket items, it's hard to say that a lot really has been decided. This year, we've got the governor's anti-rioting and looting piece of legislation that's come out. He stood with the speaker and the Senate president in a press conference. Those are type of things that generally are pretty cooked. Now, maybe it's not as timely as we move forward in a March session, but so many things happen during the course of a session. Political chits are traded between the Senate president and the House speaker in terms of what priorities they have, that it's really tough to say that a majority or even a portion of things are ultimately decided prior to session starting.
Yeah, and I'd just add on to that. It's more a question of how much momentum does something have prior to the start of session. If it's important to the Senate president or the Speaker of the House or the governor, it is going to have baked in momentum, and it's going to be harder to kill that. If it's something that's a new bill that's never been filed by a freshman member in the minority party, probably not going to have a lot of momentum. And so I think that's the better way to look at it, instead of, you know, saying, oh, well, this, you know, the die's already been cast on this one and we hadn't even started session.
Great responses. Thank you both. And with that, we'd like to thank you, Ryan and Casey, for the time that you took to not only present today, but to prepare for today and share your experiences with our attendees. You covered a lot of information in less than an hour's time, so we really appreciate that. I also would like to acknowledge the FCCMA Board of Directors for continuing to provide this type of training for its members. They've been doing it for many years, and it's a good tool way pre-COVID that FCCMA has used to provide some training. Also like to acknowledge the Professional Development Committee of FCCMA, because they put these webinars together, they identify the topics, they select presenters, speakers, and the overall program generates and initiates within that committee. So we appreciate the time that those volunteers put into this as well on behalf of FCCMA. Finally, I just want to acknowledge the attendees today. Thank you for joining and participating. Without you, there wouldn't be much value to having these webinars. So we appreciate you staying on and listening up. Finally, we do archive these webinars for those who would like to go back. I know some of you may have downloaded the PowerPoint already, but the actual visual and audio we also archive at the center, cflge.org, and that link is provided on your FCCMA website if you need to go back and review one of the webinars from the past. If you wouldn't mind just taking just a couple minutes, actually, I'm sorry, a couple seconds, because that's all it'll take to answer a few questions for the evaluation of today's webinar. FCCMA would very much appreciate that as well. So thank you all for your participation. Again, Ryan, Casey, thank you for your time. And with those final comments, we're now adjourned.